Welcome to Literary Lights, our year-long series illuminating new books by Armenian writers in English, in collaboration with the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research and the Gregor and Clara Zorab Information Center. I'm Olivia Katranjian, the founder of the International Armenian Literary Alliance, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome back Aram Mrjoian to discuss his novel, Waterline. Before we begin, I'd like to note that yesterday marked 2 years since over 100,000 Armenians were forced out of their homes in Artsakh. Several Yala members and my fellow writers still and will always contend with displacement as they navigate life in exile, and I want to take a moment to acknowledge their grief and the grief of thousands of others facing similar conditions today. Thank you so much to those who make this series possible. Judy Saryan, Mark Mamigonian, and everyone at Nasser, Jesse Arlin and the Zorab Center, Yala's executive director, Hovset Markaryan, and our social media and marketing coordinator, Nairi Simonian. I'm so excited to welcome Aram Mrjoian and Chris McCormick to host today's conversation. Chris is the author of the novel The Gimmicks, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and the short story collection Desert Boys, winner of the 2017 Stonewall Book Award, Barbara Giddings Literature Award. His essays and stories have appeared in The Atlantic, the Los Angeles Times, and the Southern Review. He's the son of an Armenian mother and American father, and he grew up in the Antelope Valley on the California side of the Mojave Desert. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Before earning his BA from the University of California, Berkeley, and his MFA from the University of Michigan. He teaches in the English department at the Phillips Exeter Academy and is at work on his next book with the support of a 2024 Creative Writing Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Thank you so much, Chris.
And thank you so much, Olivia. I appreciate you and Hovset and everyone behind the scenes. And I'm so honored to be here with Aram, who's a writer I've admired for a long time and an editor I've admired for a long time, and a man who's, I think, committed to the larger project of literary citizenship in a way that I really deeply respect. So it's a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad to see so many of you here with us today. I thought I'd introduce Aram first, just kind of the biography, and then talk just for a few minutes about what I admire so much about this novel, Waterline. I have my advanced copy with my handwritten notes in it here, but you should have your hard copy ready for you. Order that, please. Let me read the introduction first, the Aram's biography. Aram Mrjoian is the managing editor of Michigan Quarterly Review and a 2022 Creative Armenian AGBU Fellow. Aram has previously worked as an editor at the Chicago Review of Books, the Southeast Review, and Tri-Quarterly. He's also the editor of the anthology, We Are All Armenian, Voices from the Diaspora. His writing has appeared in The Guardian, Runner's World, Literary Hub, Catapult, West Branch, Electric Literature, Gulf Coast, Boulevard, Joyland Long Reads, and many other publications. He holds an MFA in creative writing from Northwestern University and a PhD in creative writing from Florida State University. He lives in Michigan, where this beautiful book is set. One thing I love about this novel is that it's a book about a family who we meet up with in the wake of a personal catastrophe, the loss of a daughter. And we follow this family in different points of view as they grapple with that grief. But it's also a book about the inheritance of a much larger catastrophe, the Armenian Genocide, and in the shape of their great-grandfather, Gregor, who was the last man on Musa Dagh as they fought to resist the Ottoman takeover. And that legacy haunts the personal tragedy, and it kind of, the book reveals the intricate web between personal loss and cultural loss in a way that's deeply profound. So it's a book that's emotionally engaging on a family level, on a personal level, but it also is a novel that asks gigantic questions about the responsibilities we inherit as inheritors of that legacy, especially with Musa Dagh, which is this kind of heroic resistance. And what do we do as inheritors of that legacy? The family is trying in different ways, some more successful than others, to live up to that legacy. And so if you're someone who's interested in those gigantic questions, in addition to the personal relationships you'll develop with these real characters, you're going to love this book. And so for those reasons, I'm really honored to be talking with the author of this novel, Aram Mrjoian. I think, Aram, if you don't mind reading from a little bit from the book first, and then we can get into some of my questions. And then after we have a conversation for a while, we'll bring in questions from the audience as well and see what's on everybody's mind. Thank you for being here, Aram.
Yeah, of course. That sounds great. Chris, thank you for the very kind and thorough introduction. It's really, I mean, it's an honor to be read by you and be kind of writing in the same era as you. The Gimmicks is such an important book to me. And in our conversation, I'm sure we can talk about that at some point. But I'll read a little bit from the second chapter of the book, starting on page 11. And I'm just going to read maybe like about 5 minutes, starting at the very beginning of that chapter. Edgar Kurkjian slid the kitchen window above the sink to a close and wiped the drenched sill with a paper towel, wondering why he paid an arm and a leg to blast the air conditioning when his wife and children so insistently allowed the cold to seep out of the house. He rinsed red and green bell peppers and left them to dry on a scrap of cheesecloth on the counter. He smashed garlic beneath the broadside of a chef's knife. He chopped white onions until tears welled behind his glasses. He hadn't grilled shish kebab since his mother died. When she was in her final years, they always made these elaborate meals together. If his mother were standing next to him now, if his mother were standing next to him at the counter now, she would scold his lack of seasoning, demand another full bulb of garlic, sprigs of fresh mint and rosemary from her long-abandoned herb garden, flecks of black peppercorn crushed from the grinder, instead of the weak powder pummeled fine as sugar Edgar shook from a McCormick tin. Chicken broth came to a boil on the stove, rice and egg noodles swimming to the surface, the smell of butter in the air, the scent of his childhood, a side of pilaf with every meal. He had wanted to grill the shish kebab in the backyard, a frigid tall boy of bells two-hearted in hand, slick with the condensation in the July sun. But the thunderstorm had entered its second unrelenting day, dousing the state from Lake Michigan to Lake Huron. The driveway was flooded, the yard waterlogged. He might have waited for the weather to cooperate if he wasn't feeling guilty for all the time he was spending out of the house. On a sunny day, the scent of charcoal and seared lamb would have sent his brother and sister-in-law lumbering over from next door with a bottle of wine. They would FaceTime his eldest daughter, Ani, and his niece, Mari. They could sit on the back patio together, a family, enjoying a meal al fresco. Instead, Edgar set the oven to broil and lined up 2 rows of flimsy damp wood skewers, like giant toothpicks, on a cookie sheet doused with olive oil. He was determined to make the meal spectacular, regardless of the torrential downpour. A fork of lightning, there then gone, in the window. Everyone had left the office early on the eve of the 4th of July holiday. It was rare Edgar found the house empty after returning from work. For once, he could make a mess of the kitchen without tripping over his family. Where were they? Little did they expect they would arrive home to a weeknight feast like the ones his mother used to pull together with ease. It was as if she could stretch time and complete a half-day's preparation in an hour. Her timing was impeccable, honed over decades spent in front of a hissing stove. Everything always landed on the table at once, steaming, elegantly plated, demanding to be consumed. Edgar was already out of sync. The pilaf would be ready before he managed to get the lamb in the oven. He needed to text Caro and Hova before they started planning their own dinner. Not a clean inch of workspace remained. The kitchen's redone granite countertops opened into a small dining area, and the hardwood stretched far past the table into a living room, with its large sectional sofa and easy chair facing a television nestled in the center of 2 floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Beyond that, there was the laundry room exiting out into the garage. He turned on the television and it came to life in the distance. The screen illuminated in the middle of a commercial for one of the many regional car dealerships. Gross Ile might as well have been a told-off extension of the Motor City. His family had surely spent a small fortune crossing over the toll bridge in the many decades they'd lived on the island. Edgar wanted to listen to the weather report, worried that if the rain kept coming, the city would cancel tomorrow's fireworks on the river. Skewers soaked, Edgar alternated between protein and vegetables, lamb pepper onion, and tried not to prick his finger. The car commercial faded into the evening news. Edgar attempted to wipe away his oniony tears with his wrists, but the water clung to his eyelids and blurred his vision. The local anchor's austere face emerged, whatever oncoming tragedy he was about to deliver, in a practiced somber tone poised to burst from his mouth. But then, like thunder, there was a banging at the front door. Thank you.
So excellent. One of the great things about this book is just these tiny details that bring every scene to life. And you can just smell and taste this opening chapter. It feels like home for a lot of us, I think. And even, my literary mind as a close reader, I'm thinking of that toll bridge from the island to the mainland of the state of Michigan, and this kind of idea of paying a toll as you cross over borders. So even tiny little details carry weight and feel written from inside the experience of this family. So just really remarkable. Thank you for reading. Can we
Thanks.
can we start a little bit more zoomed out than that though,
Yeah, yeah.
and then we can zoom back into those nerdy details that I love. Um, can I ask you? I don't know if I've ever asked you just a really basic question, which is, do you remember what are your first memories of the genocide and your cultural heritage, and how did you develop a deeper understanding of that legacy?
Hmm.
How has your understanding of not only the history but your relationship to it changed over the years?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I kind of have a complicated answer, I think, probably like a lot of people do. And I should start by saying that, like, in a lot of ways, I feel sort of like, um, like a bad Armenian, I guess, in the sense of like, like I mean, I'm very assimilated. Like, my Michigan family is pretty disconnected, sort of from some of the cultural touchstones that we might think of, the church or the language, even food, like where there's sort of a limited relationship there, but I have a very like sort of like forward, you know, framing our Armenian name. And when I was a teenager, I kind of had a sense of like some in passing, like I'd heard, my grandparents mention the genocide, or I'd heard my parents mention it. But then my dad, I think, gave me a book, by Peter Balakian, The Black Dog of Fate, and that kind of was like the door in. And I think, I think books, I think literature, fiction and nonfiction is a door in for a lot of people. And so I remember reading that book maybe 14, 15 years old and kind of being like, oh, okay, well, this leaves me like with, gives me some answers, but it also gives me a ton of questions about like what this means about our family history, what this means about my kind of personal inheritance, and some of these other things that I've been curious about for a lot of my childhood and adolescence. And it took me a long time to come to the idea of writing about any of it. And frankly, like I started my MFA in my mid 20s at age 25 or 26. And even then, I wasn't writing about any of this stuff at all. Like I'd read way more. I'd read, more fiction and nonfiction on the subject, and was like, I think, much more attuned to that history. Um, but I was sort of nervous about like how do I have a right to write about this? Like my family moved here so long ago, and like we've been in Michigan for a long time, and like, um, and I am pretty distant from the community. Like, how do I talk about this? Um, and eventually I just tried. Like, eventually I kind of was like, you know what? Like, I need to see what comes from this. Um, and a lot of stuff came out in nonfiction before fiction, I think. A lot of the essays I was writing were kind of about the books I had read or the movies I had seen. And in some cases, was like even thinking about family artifacts. I wrote this essay for Long Reads that was about this kind of folder full of newspaper clippings that my grandpa had left, that my grandfather had left my father, that just on the front says like, never forgive, never forget. And it's just full of newspaper clippings about the Armenian genocide. And like, what do you do when you walk into your parents' basement and that's like on the table, right? And you see that, and it's just like this huge overflowing manila envelope. Um, and so yeah, I think that, eventually I started saying like, I think I can write about this, but I was always writing about it from a distance. And I think even in this book, you talked about zooming out, that there is some distance from that community and some distance sort of like from uh, the Armenian American experience that these characters are grappling with. And so I've always been really sort of, I think, cognizant and concerned or cautious about like how I engage with the culture, especially in my fiction.
Yeah, and at the heart of this novel, partly is a great novel that had a huge historical impact, right? The 40 Days of Musa Dagh, and written by a German Jewish writer, right? And
Yeah.
powerful. And the characters in this novel have inherited that novel and have accessed their history through that fiction as well. So clearly, it's on the minds of the character and the author, the role of fiction in our history too. So can you talk about, now that you have written a novel, what writing fiction has complicated about your understanding of our
Yeah.
responsibility to that legacy?
Yeah, I think it opens it up in ways. And there's sort of, I'm not a historian, and so like when you look at something like again going back to Peter Balakian, like The Burning Tigress is this book that I just think is like was profound to me in that like not only is it so well researched, but like I flipped to the back index and was like, oh, here's all the articles, all the books, like everything I need to kind of like start reading on this subject matter. Um, Requires a ton of time, a ton of academic discipline. And I'm just a fiction writer. And so I'm always cautious about, you want to make sure that you're historically accurate, but you also want to make sure that you're thinking about things like memory and things about like time. And the 40 Days of Musa Dagh became a really, I think, natural way of dealing with this. That book was on my grandparents' shelf and on my parents' shelf growing up. I didn't read it until my late 20s. And I remember reading it and being like all of a sudden really fascinated with it. Even though it's super long, it's honestly really boring in a lot of places. It has a ton of problems with sort of like this ethnic fetishization and Orientalism, and like I'm reading this and going like, man, this was a really important book. Like it was a bestseller. Like this, kind of like I think awakened a lot of people to the Armenian Genocide. It was passed around, Jewish ghettos during World War II as kind of like this almost like this, guidebook of resistance. It was, Werfel's books were burned in Nazi Germany because they were really scared of kind of what this book said. Um, and I mean, even like look at our history of film. Sylvester Stallone wanted to do an adaptation. MGM wanted to do an adaptation. They kept getting canned because Turkey was not happy about the idea of this becoming a big budget film. Um, and so I was really interested in this idea of like, what does it mean to what does it mean for fiction to have that kind of power? What does it mean for the 40 Days of Musa Dagh to have introduced so many people to this historical atrocity that they didn't know about, and also to decades later like still be a point of contention that there's still this fight over um can you turn it into a movie, like how's it being read and talked about. Uh, and so I wanted to add that into Waterline and kind of layer that in. And I sort of like, with this family history, I'm using that idea of they have this historical novel that sort of hypothetically tells their family history. They also have someone in the house who lived it and is sort of, and there's this question of like, where's the line blurred? Like what all these, our great grandfather, when he's 90 years old, what is he really remembering from his adolescence? And what's he kind of like transplanting through this book? Um, and when I started doing a lot of research on Werfel, one of the articles I came across that I thought was really interesting was in this peer-reviewed journal, I can't remember, but these academics essentially argued that like Werfel did such a good job documenting Musa Dagh that like no one asked questions about like what happened after those folks got rescued by the Navy and moved. Like what's sort of the legacy of that. And so I think I was trying to fill some of that in too, through one imagined lens.
Yeah, and can we talk about that imagined lens? So you, with all these gigantic thematic and historical questions in your heart and soul, you've chosen this one family, the Kurkjian family, these two brothers, Edgar and Garo, who live next door to each other, and they have their own families. These really tight knit. It feels like one. They feel like they live in one house in my imagination. And from those large thematic questions, you have these tiny details that bring these people to life. Like I think one moment that I really loved, there's just a tiny mention of Edgar has a mole on his forehead that's pink because he's been picking at it all night because he hasn't been sleeping all night. And so I'm curious how you flip the telescope and go through the other lens when you're writing with such enormous questions. How do you move into the individual solitary lives of people to ask those questions in ways that are actually communicative to an audience?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is one of those sort of cliches of fiction, right? Is like the more specific you get, the more universal it becomes, and I think that's really true. Um, and for me, I tend to I write way too much detail, admittedly. It's and to give you sort of a behind the scenes of some of this book coming together, like when I got the first pass notes back from my editor, the 2-page sort of like, here's what we think you need to work on. One of the first things it said was like, we love all the details in this, but like cut some of that shit out. Like, like in a very polite way, it was kind of like, you're really like, you just have so much. And I think that's just the way I write. Like I'm really sort of engaged in image and setting, in character, and it allows me, I think those bigger questions open up from it naturally. Um, but I mean, the first pass of the book, I probably cut 8 to 10,000 words of some of that stuff out, and then filled it in with some broader stuff that was a little more, I guess, necessary to plot or necessary to sort of layer in the book in a different way. And so I should say I'm really flattered that and like honored that you're catching that type of stuff, because to me that's like what I love to write. And it's hard to know, what goes over, or what kind of is too much for some readers and what's not. But I think that detail, that's the stuff that tells us a lot about who these people are.
And I think it translates an experience that's beyond language in some ways, that we can feel the scratching in a way that we
Yeah.
don't even need to understand the language of what that restlessness is about. We share it, in a way that's pretty powerful, I think. Can you talk about the family members in the novel? And because it's so interesting to me that you have different generations. You have one character, Hannah, one of the wives, who isn't Armenian at all, who's married into this Armenian family. You have obviously different genders in the family too. So there's different ways that the historical context and the current context of their lives is putting different kinds of pressure on them. And I'm just really curious if you can think about these out loud with us.
Yeah.
Which of those characters were approaching these questions from angles that you hadn't approached before? Which one of them felt more familiar to you? Which of these characters feels I don't know, the access point to the whole family, if there is one for you. I'm just really curious about these people.
Definitely. And thank you for this question, because it's again, I think it's fundamental to the book, that there's these different perspectives, with each chapter, that these characters, are kind of hopefully given a lot of space to kind of be their own people and breathe. Um, and it's weird because it changes, right? And I don't want to make this too personal about me, but like I just became a father 3 weeks ago. My son was born at the end of August, and now I look at some of I look at the characters who are parents in this book now, and I'm like, man, like I would write this so differently with just like 3 weeks of understanding like what it means to have a kid. And so it's wild how we're really writing in the moment with the information we have, and that changes so much over time. Um, and so I think the hardest part of this project, to your point, is like, you have these two characters, Garo and Edgar, who are, about like in their late 40s, early 50s, who are brothers, but they're sort of experiencing middle age. Their kids are older and grown up. Some of them have left home already. But then you also have these teenage characters and characters in their early 20s, who are sort of learning all this history for the first time, like I was, and who are acting out against their personal grief, but also sort of like confusing that with what this familial legacy means. And then of course you have, the sort of the legacy characters, Gregor being this, survivor of Musa Dagh, this great grandfather figure who has been over the shoulder the whole time, kind of like passing on this history and sort of creating this legend out of himself, in ways that are probably good, but also really sort of harmful or like problematic, in how it affects this family. Um, And, you have his wife who's also survived the genocide, who like doesn't want to talk about it at all, who like it actually, her character, I had originally given her character a longer chapter, and then thought, you know what, like, but she doesn't want to talk about this history. So like the easiest way to do that on the page is just to cut it and like make it so like, the it's reported in I think a page and a half in the middle of the novel, is that Garo kind of comes to her and goes, "Hey, like, can you tell us your story?" And she goes, like, "You got the New York Times for that. Like, you have reference points. Like, here's what you need to know." And it's just a paragraph summary, um, which I think is kind of interesting in its own way. And so it's hard to know kind of these different generational sort of influences. Age and gender, like you said, are big in this. And I'll say, and I've said this in a few different interviews, it was very I think challenging, and like a challenge I took very seriously to write the women of this book, and to engage with that perspective and think about like what's important to these women, both young women and middle-aged women, who are part of this community or have entered this community through marriage. And I wish I had like sort of like something grander and smarter to say about that, but really like all I can say about it is that like I was really, it was a point of major care as I was writing and revising.
And you can feel that as you're reading it. And so it's a success in my opinion. And there are so many questions that we can dig deeper about all of these questions. I'm kind of asking umbrella questions that hopefully the audience will pick up on if they're interested to dive deeper. I'll ask one more kind of broad question, and then we'll open the floor to the audience if that's okay. And that's, I think that, one of the central tensions of the book seems to me to be about hope and despair, and the movement between those two extremes, and how can we be hopeful without being naive, and how can we acknowledge the realities of the world without falling into despair seems to be the balancing act, the precarious balancing act that the novel at least is partly aiming at. I'm curious about your feelings about that tension through writing the book, through living at this time, and where are you, especially becoming a father? Like, I have a 3-year-old, so I'm in a similar situation where I'm
Yeah.
thinking of this question. So this might be a selfish projecting question, but I'm curious about what you're thinking about this question.
No, I'm so glad you asked this too. And it's, I think you're right. The title originally was Above the Waterline, was like the working title I had going, and my editor was like, "What if we just shorten it to Waterline? Like that seems a little bit more thematically resonant." And as I talked with my wife about it and thought about it, like I said, give me a few days just to like kind of roll over what that looks like. And then eventually I realized how much I love it, not just because it's sort of a clean one-word title, but because I think to your point, the idea of a waterline is like, you can be above it and sort of gasping for air or sinking and, sort of in this abyss. And that's, I think, again, like honor to be read by you, like such a central part of this book, is this question these characters are dealing with, both personal grief and sort of inherited cultural grief. But also trying to make sense of things. I think Garo is one of my favorite characters in this book to write because he has so much environmental anxiety, and I have so much environmental anxiety. And like it's weird. I've said this in a couple other interviews, but like I started writing this book in 2018. It takes place in 2018. I think it would be a very different book if I had started writing it today. And if I was thinking about it today, when we see how different the world looks right now, and we kind of see not only what the political climate is in the US, but the way that genocide is, happening around the world right now, that there's this just mass violence in different parts of the world, and that there's not just sort of the violence we think of in terms of bombings, in terms of war, but in terms of famine, in terms of like preventing people from getting the resources they need to live their lives. I just think when I look out and go like, we're denying people vaccines, we're denying people access to food, we're allowing natural disasters to just uproot entire communities. It's so heartbreaking. And at the same time, like, you want to have some hope, right? Like, I mean, that's like I said, like you were saying as a parent, like one thing I think about all the time is like my son is born into a world where the environment is going to look so dramatically different from what my upbringing was. Like, is he even going to have winter in Michigan? Is he going to be able to sled? Is he going to be able to snowboard? Like, I don't know. It's good. You know, when are we going to build a snowman together? Ever? Maybe. Um, and are the, you know, is he going to be dealing with food scarcity? Is he going to be dealing with displacement for all of the reasons, you know, that our world looks so different? But then also, like, the way he looks at trees outside in our yard is just like the most warming thing in the world to me. Um, and like that sort of engagement is so important. And so I think it is, like you said, it's finding that line and kind of asking, like, right now with where we're at, how do we like both really actively and intentionally fight back against the horrible things that are happening in the world, that have always been there but seem really heightened right now in their own way, and really urgent because we are running out of time on a lot of things, while also, you know, being excited about books and excited about nature and, you know, taking care of each other. And so yes, I think it's a central question to the book. And it's one that it's weird, like, because, you know, I'm sure you've experienced this too, Chris, with your own books coming out, is like, you know, I signed the contract in September 2023. You know, the book comes out in June 2025. Like, the world changes so much in that time. And the way you're talking about it by the time it's actually out, and when you started writing it, it's so different.
Yeah, and so are you, right? And so
Yeah.
that compounds everything. And yeah, but that's part of what makes a great book great, is that there is something that lives beyond time in some ways. And I think there are those questions at the heart of your book that will. So thank you for writing it. I have a question from the audience. So let me turn over there. Can you please, Aram, talk more about the female characters?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, like I said, there's a couple different generations of female characters in this book. There's Hannah and Hova, who are, you know, middle-aged and sort of, you know, they're mothers. They are dealing with this grief in a way that I think is different, from their husbands, and they're thinking about it much more and understanding sort of, the pressures and realities of why Mari, you know, one of our central characters, chose to end her life in this very dramatic way. They just see that differently than the male characters in this book. Um, and the younger women in the book, I think, as well, like, understand sort of those pressures firsthand. And so, a big thing I started, honestly, like a big central question of the book starting out, was, admittedly, I'd read this article somewhere about a teacher who had lost her job, because revenge porn was posted of her on the internet. And I just thought, what a horrible thing that someone violates you in this way, and then you face the repercussions. Like, imagine, you know, that something has been done completely without your consent, this really horrible thing that you can't, you know, that once it's on the internet, you can't do anything about. And then the consequence of that is losing your job, and your life being uprooted in these ways and becoming very public in ways that you weren't prepared for. Um, and I think that's awful. And so I took that, and honestly, like, and again, this is going to sound strange, but like, it made me think a lot about Kim Kardashian and kind of, the ways in which, Armenian women are exotified and hypersexualized, and the way that you know, this sort of sex tape that launched the Kardashian empire has really had, a cultural and social influence over the way that Armenian women are perceived in the media and perceived in popular culture. Um, and so I wanted to think about that a lot through these characters in very subtle ways, and the ways that shows itself, on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it's really thought-provoking, because at first I was thinking, how is this connected to this larger grief? But it really, the novel does unfold these connections and makes you think a lot about the kind of intricacies of violence in different forms that you normally wouldn't connect automatically. We have another question from the audience. I wonder what fiction gave you, what fiction as an art form gave you to explore issues of family, memory, and trauma that was different than how you would have explored these issues in nonfiction, or have explored these issues in your nonfiction?
Yeah. Well, I mean, nonfiction, I guess the obvious thing is that, like, I think creative nonfiction, there's not necessarily a truth, or like, like that there's not, it's not entirely factual in its own sense, especially if you're writing through personal narrative, if you're writing through memory. But there is, a limitation or an intentionality of, like, that you are trying to say something that feels accurate to your experience, to your lived experience, to your historical understanding, to the research you've done. And so when I'm exploring those issues in nonfiction, I feel really like, all right, I need to make sure that I have everything in order. And also that I'm talking about things in such a way that represent who I am as a person, that represent, if I'm writing about family or friends, that represent them accurately in a way that's not going to offend them. And I mean, not to bear the burden of cultural representation, but that, represent, a certain kind of cultural history, and that I through my understanding as well. And I think, Chris, I think maybe we talked about this a little bit when I reached out and asked you to contribute to We Are All Armenian, is like one of the things that was interesting to me when I started writing nonfiction in the subject matter was how often the question came up of, like, can you give us more historical context when writing essays? Like someone being like, yo, can you give us just like a quick boilerplate about the Armenian Genocide so that we can pop that up near the front, so that when the reader is get into this stuff about, your grandfather, like get into this stuff about, like, the fact that your high school teacher, like, didn't know what the Armenian Genocide was when teaching a unit on World War I, like, like what, like, then at least your reader does. And so in the nonfiction, I always got the sense that, like, I had to explain more. And with fiction, like, you can just be like, hey, like, this is what the character knows, and like if the reader can't fill that in, that's kind of maybe in some cases their problem. And often, again, that sort of memory, those connections can become much more personal and meaningful in ways that you can access through interiority, or access through setting and situation, that you get to kind of, make up or have some imaginative control over.
Yeah, that's excellent. And the exhaustion of having to tell that story over and over again comes up.
Yeah.
The characters are grappling with that too.
Yeah, Chris, I want to ask you a question, I guess, now that you say that, and I'm curious, like, how you navigated that during any conversations you've had about the gimmicks, because like I do want to come back to it for a minute, like, and say on the record, like, fundamentally, I don't think Waterline exists without the gimmicks. Like, I think reading it in process was really important to me to kind of see what a book that, like, talks about the Armenian Genocide but isn't solely about the Armenian Genocide looks like. And I came back to it again and again, and I imagine that you've sort of had to field some of these questions in your public conversations about it as well.
Yeah, and I do want to have that conversation, but I want to let me
Okay,
go to,
all right.
yes.
I'm sorry, I'm being
I
selfish.
promise if we have time at the end, we'll come back to it. But that means a lot to me. You know that that's deeply uh, kind of you and much appreciated. Thank you, Autumn. Okay, let me go here to a reader's question. How did you decide the moment in your story when you wanted to start the book?
Yeah, in the beginning I didn't. It went through a lot of drafts and revision. I've said this again in a couple other interviews, but like the first version of this book was so messy. And I just kind of bounced from character to character and was figuring everything out and had no order to anything. And at the time, like, weirdly, I had just finished a first draft, and like I'd published a couple essays recently, and an agent reached out to me and was like, hey, do you have a novel? And I was like, yeah, here. And I sent it to him. Um, and he did me the nicest courtesy. And sorry for those. I think I've told this story in other events like this. So if you've heard the story, that's okay. But he did the nicest courtesy and called me on the phone and was like, this is cool. It's a great idea. It's a mess. Like, and was like, don't send this to other agents right now. And honestly, it was the best thing he could have done, because then I was like, all right, back to the drawing board, spend another year with this, really work on it. Um, and finding the entry point took time. Um, I think it's not an accident that I read from sort of chapter 2, which is set in 2018, that is more present, whereas the actual entry point is sort of Gregor telling this story of, you know, the resistance of Musa Dagh from his perspective, to his great granddaughters on Easter morning, in a nursing home lawn, in the 90s. And I think I came to that entry point eventually because of a lot of what we've talked about. I kind of wanted to mediate what this looks like how is history being told, and what's sort of like, and how distant is it, and like what have we lost. And so this idea of like, here's the family patriarch in his 90s sitting down telling his great granddaughters, who are way, way too young to hear this story, about it, because he knows it's probably the last time that he's ever going to have a chance to. Um, and then the book just kind of goes from there. But it took a while. It took a while to get there.
Yeah, and I think now that I'm thinking back on it, I did something similar in my book, to go back to your previous question, of dramatizing the storytelling, like making the storytelling itself part of the subject. It has been a sneaky way into
Yeah,
getting to do both, getting to contextualize, but also having it feel dramatic and not repetitive, if that makes sense.
absolutely. And I'm so sorry for putting you on the spot, by the
No, no,
way.
no. I just don't want to steal your shine, because this book deserves every minute of this conversation. So let's go to the next question. Aram and Chris, thank you both for the interesting conversation. I haven't read the book yet, but it's on my imminent to be read list. Speaking of the book title, I love it and really am drawn to the metaphor of water when it comes to catastrophes, personal, historical, familial, etc. Can you talk more about the role of water in the book?
Yeah. There's I hope you find this when you read it, that thematically water is just kind of everything in this book. You have the family that lives on this island, and so they're surrounded by water. Water is functioning as a border. In the case of Musa Dagh, like obviously the French Navy coming to the rescue by water is really important. Um, the sort of inciting incident of Mari choosing to end her life by swimming out into Lake Michigan is a very different, way of looking at the water. And so again, like Waterline, this idea of above or below, I think is central to the whole thing. That it can really be like the water is personally, honestly, just water freaks me out. Like I get really nervous around oceans, around the Great Lakes. Again, like thinking about water geographically, Michigan is the Great Lake state. There's lakes all around us that are enormous and beautiful, and account for like 10% of the world's fresh water. Um, but they're scary as hell. Like, I mean, if you're out and just like looking into the abyss. Um, and so there's this sense of like, what does it mean to be submerged? And then also, what does it mean to kind of like break the surface and be above that? Um, and the last thing I'll say that water was really important to me in the book, is again, I think very subtly, this book is more about climate anxiety than maybe it lets on. And I think there's a lot of environmental elements to this as well. And I mean, I just like the world feels like it's going to flood, right? Like it feels like the ice caps are melting and like the water line is rising, and like there's sort of this very like real reality of like we're running out of time, and water is there. And so that was an important sort of image for it too. The last thing I'll say is, maybe a couple allusions to Noah's Ark in there as well, for very obvious reasons. And I'll just leave it at that. Those can be your Easter eggs to find.
Yeah, even the like the bourbon brand, or I'm not bourbon, the is it whiskey? It just
The
whiskey.
brandy, yeah.
That's brandy. That's right. Ararat, the brandy. Okay. More questions here. I love listening to certain music to help me enter the world of a project. You use music to show character time and again in this novel. Can you talk about that? And did you have certain music that helped you enter this world?
Yeah. I did. I listened. So I'm a sad boy, and I listened to a lot of the National and Sufjan Stevens while I wrote this. And Sufjan in particular, Sufjan Stevens is from Detroit, if you don't know his music. And one of his early albums is just titled Michigan and is like very beautiful music about Michigan. And that became really a central album for writing this book. I'd be, of course, remiss. I listened to a lot of System of the Down while I wrote this book. And you know, that kind of at times when I was like, oh, I need like to write an angry section or a section where someone's mad, System of a Down came in clutch for that. But then also like again, I'm really attached to Michigan. And so Jay Dilla, you know, even some Eminem, like Eminem gets a couple shout outs in this, like music that is close to this geography helped me kind of navigate a lot of that. Um, and so yeah, I think you know the character's taste in music is sometimes my own, but sometimes is also sort of a dated version of my own, or is also you know just their kind of relationship to the world. But thank you for noticing that because that's huge.
I'm glad somebody asked that question because music, there should be a soundtrack to this book. Like there are so many songs that are mentioned, and I was hearing them as I was reading as you mentioned them. So it's really important to the characters, especially the young characters who are kind of forming themselves still as they're listening to this music.
Yeah, and I really just can't emphasize enough Sufjan Stevens because I feel like if we're talking about someone who like sort of navigates grief and joy really well, I can't believe his music is really special.
Yeah. We've got another one here, and it seems there's a caveat here that it's a broad one, so no pressure to ask or answer or take it where you will, Autumn. I haven't read it yet, so let's find out what this is together. Considering the rapid rise of AI and the timing of when you began writing your book and completed it, how much of the book was affected by AI? And what's your perspective on how AI will shape the future of novels?
Yeah, this is a tough one.
Yeah.
And I'll say, I just don't use AI in my writing. I'm not interested in it. Like, it's never been part of my process. As an editor, Michigan Quarterly Review is actually doing an AI issue in the fall that our editor-in-chief really wanted to do. And his argument was kind of like, if we don't do it first, someone else will. And I thought that at least is like you know, not a bad argument. We had a really great guest editor put it together. And every piece in there has a process statement, which to me are honestly the most interesting thing editorially in terms of like, and this is maybe my own shortcoming is like I'm not necessarily interested in what a machine can do in terms of literature. I'm just not. But when someone explains their process to me of how they're using certain parameters and certain technologies to create literature, that to me is at least sort of interesting in its own way. But I'm really nervous about this. I am, in part because I think AI is just going to create a lot of subpar art and art that is not doing the things that we want of it, right? Like, I mean, that is not emotionally or intellectually or culturally invested because it doesn't have that sort of range of intelligence, or like if it does have that range of intelligence, it's, you know, sort of zeros and ones. It's not necessarily the way that we interact with the world. And so I think, you know, I expect that more and more novels probably will use AI. I mean, and there's certainly, Chris, I imagine you feel this too, the sort of nervousness about like, well, eventually like is AI, like our publishers just gonna be like, well, like this computer can put out a book and like, why would I pay someone anymore when that's the easier route? Um, but I just don't know that that's a sort of genuine way or a critical way of engaging with the humanities. And so I should say, like, if part of this question comes from using AI in your own work, please don't let me discourage you from that process. But for me, I think there's a ton of ethical questions in terms of copyright and how that AI is fed. I think there's a ton of environmental questions about how much energy and water and electricity AI uses. And I think there's the question of like, what do we really want from books? And for me, that's always been human connection, not necessarily connection with some sort of large language model. And so I'm resistant to it, I guess, is the short answer.
That was really well done on the spot too. I have a lot of thoughts too, but that's a whole other conversation. I hope we can have it soon. I know you're probably busy for a while, but maybe when things settle down over there, we can have that chat.
Once I get a full night's sleep, I'm ready.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, Adam, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to turn it back over to Olivia for some for announcements. And I just want to say thank you again to all the participants, all the attendant people. It's so great to see a crowded room here. And what a beautiful book. Adam, thank you so much for writing it.
Chris, thank you as well. I really appreciate it.
This was such a treat. First, I want to thank Chris McCormick for hosting today's event. 5 years ago, I opened the New York Times Book Review and I saw your novel, The Gimmicks. And I was at once so excited to see an Armenian story and at the same time so surprised that no one in the community had mentioned it to me, that I knew we had to create an organization like Yala to spread the word about such luminous stories. And thank you, Aram, for sharing this beautiful novel with us, and bravo. It's a novel about grief, but also about withholding, and not only the trauma we inherit, but how it can multiply between family members. I found it ultimately so uplifting. The interlude tells the history of Armenians, but it ends with such powerful lines. We rose and rose and rose. We allowed our voices to echo. It filled me with such hope and inspiration and this feeling of momentum that I want to thank you for that. If you haven't already, I strongly urge you to drop everything and buy this book or ask your library to order it. You can purchase books through Yala's bookshop.org shop or at the Nasser bookstore online and in person. Our next Literary Lights event is on October 19th. It will feature Nicole Haratunian's novel In Stories, Choose This Now, which I absolutely loved. And quick reminder that the application period is now open for our 4 grants in literary translation and creative writing. Our creative writing grant will be judged by Chris. Thank you, Chris. Learn more at our website and submit your applications by September 30th. Thank you both again. Thank you everyone for coming, and to our partners. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.